Okay, welcome everyone. My name's Ben Newell. I'm a clinical psychologist with the Child and Adolescent Mental Health Service in Guernsey. I put together a talk this evening looking a bit about teenage brain development and some of the links this might have to teenagers' emotions and behaviour and this sort of thing. And in the sort of second part of the talk, I'm hoping to cover a little bit about some of the sort of approaches, plans, routines and things that parents might and carers might kind of try and keep in mind when they try and tackle their teenagers' developmental needs. And I've put up here, as you can see, sort of beautiful brain, tricky brain. Okay, so I'm going to go on to talk a bit about the development of the brain in the teenage years. And I hope everyone goes away with a sense that actually, by design, teenagers' brains are quite tricky, but also they're amazingly beautiful as well. You know, it's actually a period of development where we can learn how to think creatively in more abstract terms. You know, we can kind of go to the moon and back with the development that happens with the teenage brain. So it's a really beautiful period as well. But I'm sure if you're sat here tonight, you've been invited, or you might come because of the trickier part. So hopefully we'll come up with some tips about that. Okay, I have to probably try and stay still for the camera. Okay. Okay, so this is a talk about the developmental changes that all teenagers go through, and with particular reference to quite significant changes that happen in the structure and the function of the brain, and how this affects emotions and behaviour. And I just thought I'd start with a couple of questions for people to maybe keep in mind as we go through the talk. And the first one of that might be, who has the greatest influence on teenagers' development and their decisions, their behaviour? So just keep that in mind. And secondly, away from the day-to-day kind of ups and downs of parenting or caring for a teenager, looking at the long game, the long-term outcomes. If you felt that you'd really helped your teenager get through this period, what outcomes would you be looking for? So just keeping those in mind. My experience working with parents of teens, and from looking at all the research that's done in this area now, is that parents and carers remain a huge important influence in their teens' development, despite the rise of other influences. And we know that those influences are really powerful and important in teen years. And that when parents are talking about the kind of long-term goals, they can kind of keep that long game in mind. Sometimes they can, you know, they'll obviously talk about wanting their children to develop it into well-functioning, well-rounded individuals, able to make and sustain relationships, you know, work independently, that sort of thing, and to be happy. However, we know that day to day, we're not always keeping that kind of long-term goal in mind. And actually, you know, teen years can be really up and down, and they can represent a real challenge to those goals, and certainly a challenge to patients and sometimes to everyone's emotional well-being. And this is especially the case when teenagers maybe have additional problems and are maybe more oppositional, defiant, maybe more aggressive, and sometimes when they're engaging in worrying or risky behaviour. And certainly as well, sometimes if they're just very shy or passive or avoidant of challenges. So in brief, I'm going to be covering these following areas. I'm going to look at teenage brain development, something about risks and the influences that are there for teenagers, certainly coming back with what we know from the research, so not just the sort of hearsay, but what we know from research studies, looking at conduct, behaviour and emotions, and thinking about what helps. So I guess we all know that adolescence involves some really dramatic physical changes, social changes, mental changes. We can see this really obviously on the outside. But more recently, we've been able to see much more about what's going on in the inside of teenagers' brains through research studies, and a lot to do with the sort of advance in terms of brain scans. And we can see that there's a really significant period of development and change in terms of the teenagers' brains. And what this has also helped us understand is actually this sort of period of teenage years it is probably less helpful in that a lot of these changes start with puberty, but actually don't finish until probably somewhere in the early to mid-20s. So suddenly we're starting to think about adolescence maybe as a sort of broader timescale. So I hope that doesn't fill you with too much sort of apprehension about the task being that much longer, but also some hope as well that this is a sort of longer period that you can support young people, or services can support young people to sort of optimise their outcomes and have best chances in life. So one of the things we might hear from teenagers is, you don't understand me, nobody understands me, this sort of thing. And interestingly, as more research has been done into this area, it in a sense, we've started to sort of answer that and say, well, actually that's true. We don't have a good enough understanding of the teenage brain, and certainly society probably doesn't. And it's often quite sort of damning of teenagers. So I've left a reference at the end as well to this professor, who's the picture is just here. This is Professor Sarah Jane Blakemore, and she's kind of advises policymakers and that sort of thing, and she has advised on the fact that actually teenagers are probably right, people don't understand them that well. But research is changing this, and she's done a lot of research into brain scans, giving teenagers tasks, looking at the influence of peers and risk and things like that on what's actually happening sort of up top. So, what we do know is that teens are facing the biggest changes in brain development certainly since infancy. In fact, we used to think that the biggest amount of brain growth happened during the first sort of months and years of life. You know, and often you see little infants with quite big heads because of all that brain that's grown inside it. But actually, what we now know is that there's a sort of peak in adolescence. So hopefully people have heard of the sort of term grey matter. Yeah, we often, you know, refer to that in terms of our sort of brain power. So if we're thinking about grey matter, we're actually talking about the kind of grey coloured outer part of the brain that looks a bit like sort of screwed up newspaper, if you think about a picture of a brain. And what we might call this is the clever thinky part of the brain. Okay, it's the bit that very much makes us human. It gives us language. It also helps with memory, problem solving, planning ahead, organisation, that sort of thing. Now what's happening is in the teen years, it's actually a peak for that grey matter to development. So we often use a bit of a gardening analogy for this, and we talk about a period of blooming. So there's a rapid growth in terms of all the brain cells that are building up of that grey matter. So yeah, there's this bloom or sprouting of lots of new brain cells. At the same time, as we go through adolescence, there's a cutting back of those as well. So we often refer to that as pruning. So what tends to happen is the more efficient and more regularly used pathways in the brain kind of get sped up, they get insulated, they become more efficient. What happens to the ones we don't use? They become a bit like sort of disused roads, and they, you know, kind of disappear, you know, and they're sort of cut back and they're not. So in a way, it's a really critical period. It's really important that the good brain connections are made, and it's also a period where sort of loss of brain connectivity can occur as well. So it's also a fairly good explanation as to why teenagers are actually quite tired a lot of the time and have quite a lot of difficulty getting up. So if you remember having an infant, they probably slept quite a lot, didn't they? And a lot of that is to do with the development that was going on in their bodies and brains. And similarly, there's this massive expansion and growth of teenagers' brains. And unsurprisingly, we now know that actually that causes a lot of sleepiness, tiredness, and often being kind of out of sync with the rest of family, school hours, all this sort of thing. And obviously, teens can make this a lot worse by staying up half the night on Facebook and things like this. But there is a reality there that actually they're finding it quite hard sometimes to kind of override what is needed in terms of additional sleep and that sort of thing. So sometimes they're going to need a bit more downtime. So in a sense, it's effectively a kind of system upgrade, you know, an improvement to the operating system and an improvement to the kind of services that are going on in the brain. And what we seem to be understanding now, that this is actually really necessary to sort of the survival of that individual in the future. So the changes that are happening, as often we're might be pulling your hair out or finding really big challenges trying to meet those long-term goals, that long game. We actually know that a lot of the sort of up and downness of the teen years is actually really part of a helpful process. I'm not saying that's the case in every case, and it isn't exacerbated or made worse by particular factors or problems. But hopefully by the end of the talk, I get a sense that actually some of the storm that goes on is actually part of development itself. However, the brain's not developing in a nice, neat, uniform way across the outer surface of the brain where it's got the grey matter, this clever thinky part. And certainly it develops both, it's not even, and nor is it consistent. So we might see those gains where young people are seem to be using more sophisticated thinking, taking more sensible actions one day, and then another day seeming to sort of revert to sort of almost more simple or sort of more like child type decision making and that sort of thing. So we've got that kind of inconsistency, and again that seems to map on to the fact that you've got different pathways, and one is kind of being made better, you know, it's going to be like upgrading the motorway, and one might be over time, if the other one's better, being sort of let go of and less efficient. But you're going to have that time with that inconsistency where you've got kind of two routes, got an A road and a B road kind of thing. Not that means much in Guernsey. Anyway, and what we do know is it's not even. So it's maybe unsurprising that the bits of the brain that develop early on tend to be around things like physical coordination and that sort of thing. And we're maybe unsurprised that we get 16, 17, 18-year-olds who are actually at sort of probably peak physical ability and the fitness and things like this, and are competing at a sort of international level at sports or something. But actually the bit that might make life a bit easier, which is actually the front of the brain, which is what we call the prefrontal cortex, is the bit that's actually last to develop. So it's almost like the most sophisticated bit develops last. And again, I think there's probably a reason in development and evolution for this, that actually the bit that needs the most work, and we don't want to rush its development, is actually kind of organising and reaching maturity at a point when the young person is expected to go into the world and function in a more flexible, organising themselves way, so sort of late adolescence and early adulthood and things. So, however, it doesn't make the job of parenting, or if you're a young person, kind of managing the sort of day-to-day stresses and strains any easier. So you're going to have this bit of the brain, which, I'm sorry it's a bit blurred, but you've got one that tackles the emotional responses, you've got one that actually coordinates behaviour, what action to take, whether something's safe or risky to do, and making those sorts of judgments are the ones that are actually happening last. And there's an important element also that's going on with that development, that part of the brain. That's kind of, you might also call that our social brain. That's the bit of the brain that actually is able to think about what other people's minds are doing, okay? Which is really kind of quite helpful to surviving in the social world, isn't it? So its ability to sort of think about how someone else might feel, how someone else might think, and to plan your behaviour and communication accordingly. So, quick bit about the headlines about the teenage brain. It's the peak of the grey matter development, so we've got this blooming all those cells, but also we've got an enhanced connections. So the brain's getting quicker, more efficient, doing hopefully the things it wants to be doing at the time it wants to be doing them. There's also these lost connections as well, so things are pruned away as well as the brain actually starts to get smaller for the first time, so as it goes into adulthood. It's likely to be kind of tiring for the teenager, and it's inconsistent. The most sophisticated bit is last. Probably around the age of 15 is also the peak for risky and sensation-seeking behaviour. But what we actually find out is that what we might call impulsivity, acting without thinking, actually starts to reduce from about the age of 10 onwards. So while we often think teenagers are really impulsive and make decisions without thinking or act without thinking, actually from about the age of 10 that's improving. So what we tend to find in the research is that often teenagers are thinking, but they're still making those decisions. which I think gives us a bit of hope, because acting without thinking is really tricky, isn't it? Trying to get the brakes put on. But actually, if there is some evidence that teenagers are probably thinking, but maybe still making poor decisions sometimes, there's a bit of a window of opportunity there to help them develop skills to make safer, different decisions, that sort of thing. And when we do research, we actually find out that teens assess risk at about the same level as adults. So they see the dangers, they see the risks in situations often the same as adults. And the same as adults do, they can even overestimate the risks in situations. However, different from adults, although, or what we might call people who have got brain maturity, is that they tend to be more influenced by peers. And one of the interesting things that comes out is it's not just being around peers, it's peers actively influencing the teenager. So actually encouraging them to do certain actions. So, for example, drive faster or something like that would be an example. At the same time, the more hopeful message of that is it works both ways. Teens are also really influenced by their peers when their peers encourage them to make sensible or safer decisions. So it's a helpful message, I suppose, in thinking about the ways in which you work with your teen and their friends, and how you help them make decisions about what are useful friendships and things. And it's this development in terms of social thinking and understanding, perspective taking, social problem solving, and what we call kind of mentalization, making sense of and being able to pay attention to the mental states of others, which is kind of really handy in a relationship, isn't it? Noticing that someone else appears upset, noticing what you might have said that might have upset them, that sort of thing. So, in terms of what we know about teen development, a lot of the literature, a lot of the research used to kind of go on and on about it's a period of storm and stress, and it was all very focused around all the kind of negatives. But actually what we seem to be saying is that actually it's really functional. So it's almost like a sort of perfect storm, they are processes that teen needs to go through. The teen's effectively learning how to cope away from adults and family, away from that base, and thinking about how they're going to cope in a world where actually the people they spend most time with end up being their peers. And if they don't spend time working out that and how they're going to do that with the important influence of parents, adults, carers, then they're going to have missed out on some developmental needs there. So it is a kind of perfect storm. However, we know that there's risks, and often, it's important to bear in mind that, they are rare, but, they could be significant. I think that's, so it's a kind of perfect storm, but a fragile vessel, a fragile ship, and you're kind of there still at the helm to some degree to try and sort of steer this through this perfect storm. Okay. So when we think about risk, what we used to talk about is that parents would overestimate risk and teens would underestimate risk. And we'd get this obvious disagreement here. So parents would think the absolute worst would happen, and teens would completely dismiss this usually and say, don't talk such rubbish, of course that isn't going to happen, of course that isn't going to happen. And in a way, parents estimating risk at higher is good design. That's good evolutionary design, isn't it? You're keeping your offspring safe. What we know is that teens probably, on the whole, aren't underestimating risks. They've had so much input at schools about safe sex and drugs and alcohol and things like that. They actually know quite a lot about the risks involved. So what we find looking at the research is, rather than underestimating risks, is that they're doing a bit of a different decision-making process with risk. So what tends to happen is they're kind of trying to balance out reward versus risk. And often the reward is kind of coming out as the most important thing, which might be about social acceptance with friends, not risking social exclusion. And so other decisions are influenced by other factors. They might want to be seen as socially or sexually attractive to others. And maybe the greatest risk the teen is seeing is social rejection, because you can't function if you're not in a sort of social group when you reach adulthood as well. So, who has the most influence? Well, we definitely know that compared to childhood, there are significant other influences. But the research does definitely tell us that parents are still well in there. I mentioned earlier that risk decisions can be negatively influenced by peers, encouraging risk actions, but the reverse is also true. So it works both ways in terms of peers. Parents do remain, in the research, very significant influence in things like teens' sexual behaviour, their choices about careers and jobs, and other important aspects of decisions going forward in their development. And actually, parents have an influence on the influence of peers. Okay, so one thing that can be a trap to try and avoid is the trap where you may disagree with your teens' friends' opinions or beliefs or values and things like this. And this actually can lead, it's been shown to it can actually lead to the teenager being more influenced by the peer rather than less. So while your best intentions are around saying, see it my way, I'm the grown-up, I've been through this, there runs the risk of, if you actually are an opposite to their ideas and values, that they actually invest more belief into the peers' ideas. Again, the hopeful message about that is being aware of that hopefully encourages parents to be kind of curious about their teens' friends, what their friends' ideas and beliefs are, rather than rejecting them, and trying to build a relationship with those teens as well. And ultimately, wouldn't it be great if we could encourage your own teens and their friends to influence each other positively to make safe decisions? And I think I'm not really here tonight to talk entirely about biology as well, but we know that biology is driving the changes in the brain, but it is influenced by outside. So the kind of ultimate shape of how that changes will obviously be influenced by what we might call the social environment, how other people act towards you. And there's obvious influences by things like biology around physical changes, and that's going to make teenagers interested in things that they weren't interested in prior to puberty.